How can operators ensure that their customers are gambling in a responsible and sustainable way?
This is actually a subject I do like to touch on. I'm going to make it a bit controversial. As a platform provider, as an operator, and a license holder, this is always the constant argument that we're making. It is in today's market quite tough for operators to come into the market and then look at current regulated RG practices, but also make it sustainable. So I want to kick off with a subject that is close to any operator's heart, because I feel from my experience that a lot of operators for many, many years, especially online operators more so than others, are highly regulated. If you compare the land-based operation to the online operation, there's always been this discrepancy. I think online operators have always been more highly regulated, possibly for good reason. But this is going to be my first question. I'm going to start with you, Jaime, on the end. Why is it that the market always seems to regulate the online world a little bit more stringent than the land-based operations?
So I am a bit biased when it comes to regulation, because we're on the other spectrum. We're a training provider that helps with the enforcement of regulation through education, right? And I don't believe it's about over-regulation. I think that there's been a lot of copy-paste approach to many markets, without considering the demographic, the complications of each of those markets in an individual basis. And because of that, you've had markets which have heavily overregulated in recent years, which has actually created more of a black-gray market approach, right? Not to mention any markets, but probably Germany is a good example, where overregulation has allowed unregulated businesses operate quite well over these last few years.
Well, that's actually very interesting. I was actually going to go into that towards the end, touching on the black markets, because as you've touched it now, I'm going to kick off straight with that. The reality is, wherever you overregulate, you're going to end up with a black market. You've seen operators today coming out of all jurisdictions, targeting a new crypto world of gaming. And it's very difficult for operators coming into the market today who want to follow the rules, who want to, follow the jurisdictions to actually be competitive. I mean, if you look at markets that allow for huge transactions without limitations, regions of the world that are, let's not say entirely unregulated, but a little bit more flexible, you're creating a market where people say, well, I'm not going to go with the MGA, or I'm not going to go with Curacao. I'm going to go set up shop in Asia and just target everyone with crypto. And I think this is really what's happening. And there's a very key word in this title, sustainable, because it does need to be sustainable. I think the road goes both ways. I think operators, need to follow the rules, and there are some operators that give really bad names. But at the same time, it's very tough to launch. So, I'm going to jump onto you, Stephen, now. Your experience looking at multiple brands, offering service, where is the trend in regulation? I mean, is it responsible gambling becoming simply a trend because they're required to, or is it more of a CSR? We want to show we're doing well.
Well, responsible gambling has only really moved itself to the forefront of the industry over the last 5 years. We've kind of watched the whole cultural movement of it being taken very seriously, like responsible gambling. Responsible gambling, it's very difficult to. Every market differs from one to the next, and it's very important that we should maybe try to take a uniform approach in terms of how we act toward responsible gambling. And when I say that, I mean outside of the realms of compliance and regulation. So you see different things like to make the industry sustainable. We've watched the entrance of artificial intelligence into the industry over the last, 5 years, and machine learning. And yeah, in terms of sustaining the industry, I guess what we do in terms of player tracking, it's one way to really monitor the customer base for problematic customer behaviors. So when I say monitoring the customer base, we help operators around the world understand their player base. And when I say understand, it's how we pick up on various types of behaviors that would be considered problematic. When you're comparing, to go back to your question, is it just smokes and mirrors, or is it are we doing it adequately? In my opinion, as a global industry, I think we can do a lot more. Like, I would like to see more done outside of the scope of regulation. If I turn my attention toward Africa, for example, new and emerging markets, when most markets tend to regulate and open, they do so without a strong emphasis around responsible gambling. If you look toward places like sub-Saharan Africa, for example, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, there is no infrastructure for the prevention and treatment of gambling disorder. And I believe that for sustaining the industry, it's a fine balancing act about monetizing the industry commercially, but being socially responsible at the same time. And we all know when we look toward the UK, self-regulation does not work. And I know so because my previous experience was heavily involved in national self-exclusion. And my boss, my old boss, was actually the driver behind the white paper that came to the UK market. So whenever I'm speaking in the US and we're discussing what not to do, look toward the UK because self-regulation does not work. And then if I give it examples over to what I'm witnessing in Africa at the moment, like Kenya in particular has the highest levels of gambling-related suicide. And that's because there is no national self-exclusion scheme or infrastructure for the prevention and treatment of gambling disorder.
You touched on something really interesting over there because you said self-control doesn't work at the end of the day.
Yeah.
In some markets, yes, but at what point do you draw that line? And sorry if I sound like I'm rooting for the operators here, but let's say the operator, and I'm going to touch on Betsson soon because you are a massively respected CSR brand. You know, at what point do you say, we think you have a problem, you're not allowed to play anymore? You know, when do we cross the line and go from RG into Authorian? I thought Jaime wanted to jump up in this one.
It's usually when a withdrawal is requested. That's when all of the checks come in, right? And this is what I think is a bit of a challenge. Sorry to jump in on this, but you know, and we've seen this in many regulated markets, mature and otherwise. There's the ability to deposit vast amounts of money is far quicker than the ability to withdraw, right? So there is a bit of a disconnect between what the regulators are trying to do in terms of protection, but also what it is that the operators are capitalizing on because they're allowed to have these kind of processes. Is that, you know, it's creating addiction in itself. If you have a player who's won a substantial amount of money and they are unable to withdraw that money because you can take them through weeks of checks and, you know, give us your documentation, you know, give us your birth certificate, give us everything. By that time, 70% of gamblers would lose their winnings. And that is creating even more addiction.
That's a really interesting one because you see that a lot in the market. You know, you didn't pass KYC, by the way, your funds are back in your wallet, you know, and that's a big practice. Look, I want to touch on Betsson because you are such an established brand. I mean, what are some practices that you can that are being put into place to identify responsible gambling? Edwards.
Well, firstly, I think if your checks come into play when someone is trying to withdraw the money, then you have failed, frankly speaking. That shouldn't happen. The checks should happen on the deposit stage. The checks should happen during the gameplay. They can happen after the gameplay, but not when someone is trying to deposit and, withdraw, unless these are strictly regulatory checks that are required for a withdrawal. We take that aside. But for RG, I think we should be a little bit faster than that, and we should make our checks as quickly as we can. Surely not during the withdrawal. So that just to comment on the previous conversation in general, I think it's a good discussion point and it's a great topic, but it's extremely hard to comment precisely when we're trying to discuss everything, because as it happens, when you discuss everything, you discuss really nothing. The world is very diverse. What happens in Africa, as Steven was saying, is very different from what happens in Latin America. What happens in Latin America is different from what happens in Europe. And frankly, even in Europe or in Latin America, all these countries that we have, they have very different approaches. What the regulators are doing in Spain is very different from what the regulators are doing in the UK. The Dutch approach and the German approach and the Greek approach and the Italian approach have nothing to do with each other. Nothing, literally.
So this is where it gets interesting. So is it about the regulators or is it about human behavior? Because I think this is the key separation between responsible gambling and regulation. Responsible gambling, in our opinion, is ensuring that this behavior, regardless of what the regulators say, shouldn't happen. Humans have a tendency for addiction. I'm saying that just as an example statement. Should we then require customers to take a series of psychological tests before? This is an exaggeration, obviously, but a series of psychological tests before they sign up to the product to assess that we are reducing risk? Or are we now, the more common practice, looking at behaviors? Because, this is the definition. And even though markets are different, it seems like a little bit of a fail-safe. Oh, if we're taking a customer from the UK, they're protected, but someone in Africa isn't.
No, but that's not what I said. I said that, and what I do agree is that, of course, it depends on the regulators, but it will also depend on the society. It's lots of pieces to that puzzle, and there is no one-dimensional approach. And of course, the tracking and the checks should be done along the way. I'm sure Steven will agree. And there is a lot of solutions that offer that. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to do something in advance. We don't need to pre-screen anything before the onboarding. We're good enough to identify them quite fast when they actually start gambling. Then the big question, I think, and this is what I like to discuss as well, is how you actually address that. Because the identification part, I think, is relatively set. Yeah. We know what we want to achieve. We know what we do. We know how we do that. We know based on what parameters we do that. The question is how we use that data, whether we use that data, and if we do, how we use that data.
So that's actually really interesting, because I think what's happening now, and Stephen, you touched on it as well, AI is quite interesting, because ultimately what we're doing is we're introducing huge amounts of analytical behavior and being able to process a persona of a customer. Doesn't mean everyone falls into that persona. But I just want to switch over to you, Ian, for a second, get a bit of feedback. What do you see? What's your idea of responsible gambling?
There you go. That is probably what we're for, right? The most important part. The whole question itself that we're looking at the moment, many layers to that. How can operators? Why just operators? You already touched on the regulator's responsibility, so why is it solely operators? So Kwiff, as an operator, B2C, has its own platform, very lucky with that, good relationships with the UK, one of our major markets, licensed there, look internationally for our journey and how we develop that. We've come from a UK mindset, so transitioning that away, maybe being led by that regulator to learn what other regulators want. UK will always say it's the operator's responsibility. Of course it will. Of course it will. They're pretty aggressive like that. And then you're looking at your customers, your players, and are they gambling in a responsible? So your question's about responsible. What is responsible? Of course, the question only mentions gambling. People spend a lot of time on site. Is that a problem? Like, we will look at metrics across a range of issues, and it's not just dollar. It's not just euro and pound, and it shouldn't be. I have to agree. We're not an operator, and I don't think many operators really in that area are looking at withdrawal stage anymore. We've been browbeaten into many different areas, and time on site, for example, we're looking at that, not just gambling. It's a huge impact. And then, of course, we're looking at sustainable. What is sustainable for who? Sustainable for the operator? Sustainable for the affiliates that feed us traffic? Sustainable for the regulator? Sustainable for the player? Loads of different questions here.
So, that's really interesting. And you touched on something that I really wanted to speak about as well. Who's responsible? Is it the operator? Obviously, the operator is, at the end of the day, the company seen making money, right? But at the same time, and if there's probably any game providers in the house, they're not going to like this one, but are the game providers some way responsible for making addictive games or really entertaining games? This is maybe going out there on a whim, but an alcohol store isn't responsible for alcohol addiction, but an operator is responsible for. Now, I know I'm going out on a whim on that one. It's just an extreme case. But it is interesting because it seems like the regulator sets the rule, and now if there's a problem gambler, the regulator says, okay, the operator, you're responsible for that addict, regardless of how our society behaves towards
But do
gambling.
they define that for us? I think they often leave it for us to decide. So that's maybe the sort of secret part of a lot of our roles, is trying to establish what that means for us, for our business, for our operation and for our players. It's very difficult. And a regulator will often tell you got it wrong and will very rarely tell you got it right.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately what happens, in my opinion, okay, and this is something, you know, that we spoke about, funnily enough, in a previous discussion when we were talking about where we're going to get our new licenses for our own platform. You know, there were some ideas thrown into the wind. Are operators eventually going to have to restrict screen time or play time for customers? Now, does that actually reduce gambling? I think not. I actually think what it does, it is opens up the door for customers to open with 5 or 6 operators. And in turn, you have less data to qualify that person. And I see you wanting to jump in on this one.
It's making me laugh because this goes back to the topic of education. I was actually going to stir a debate, and you've just sparked it with that comment. So, like, if you're not promoting RG tools, you could argue you're not educating, right? And I think education, there's a balance in that going on there, or there's a battle almost, and it's like, are operators educating adequately, or are they just passively delivering information behind different clicks in a page? So in my opinion, like, you need to be a bit more forceful in terms of empowering your customer base to actually know what they're actually gambling on in some of the games, the availability of responsible gambling tools and services, and what's like therapy and self-exclusion and all these topics when somebody falls through the cracks and becomes harmed.
100%. And you touched on something, education. And yes. I think, you know, probably this is where Jaime can jump in again. I think ultimately it is the operator who is liaising with that customer. They need to recognize this behavior. And going towards the iGaming Academy, I know you guys are doing a lot over there. I mean, what are the current practices? What is the push to educate customer support and casino managers to recognize this behavior?
Yeah, look, responsible gambling tools includes education, right? You can't have a full suite of tools if you're not educating the workforce on the regulatory requirements, managing players and protecting players, dealing with addiction, and it actually spreads out to a lot more. You know, there's things around certain behaviors and customer interaction, and you know, there's things even going even deeper into suicide prevention, right? So there's a whole array of training which now fits into the model of many different jurisdictions. Today, we are training over 60,000 employees on a yearly basis, mostly on responsible gambling. We have, I think this year we've done about 58,000 employees educated on responsible gambling. We're covering over 20 jurisdictions, including the US. And I think in some markets, as we've aligned with the regulators and the requirements of those regulators, we've seen really good response rates and really good engagement from the staff base. But then in other markets, it is a tick box exercise. You know, many operators and B2Bs utilize training as a tick box exercise because the requirement is quite straightforward. Do responsible gambling training, prove that you've done it, and we'll come and check you possibly sometime this year.
Well, that's interesting because literally that's the other part of this, you know, panel. We're talking about RG, but what about sustainability? When does it become so unsustainable for the operator when it comes to certain practices? Now, I think there's a very big difference between being responsible and protecting your customer base and following regulation, because it seems whenever we touch on regulation, we're then going into RG. Oh, we're doing this because our regulator says we must. But at what point do we draw that line and says, here is the fine balance. Here is, you know, where we can ultimately, operators need to make money to sustain their product, which is meant to be entertainment. But at the same time, these are the situations we need to avoid. And the issue with today's market, it is a global market. I can open an account from 50 different jurisdictions. You know, each one of those jurisdictions has a different practice. There's no collective practice today. One of the few, maybe the UK, being, let's say, one of the more mature markets. But, you know, going back to big brands like Betsson, obviously you are an internationally recognized brand. You know, at what point do you see the market, you know, collapsing on itself or potentially pushing away regulation? Because we've seen so much regulation change over the last 5 years. You know, big changes in Curacao, slight downturn in the MGA, you know, new regulators coming into the market, Estonia, Melilla and Kuwait are coming into the market as well. You know, where is the future? The EU once held a lot of, let's say, weight within that market. Do you think the EU will continue to lead the way in responsible gambling?
Yes, I think it will remain one of the key areas and one of the trendsetters. It's really, as I said, the world is very diverse and you cannot really shrink it all down to what happens in the EU, let's say, because there is many areas that are outside of that. But here, I personally think that, as you said, it's not just about the responsibility, it's also about the general approach, and you need to have a minimum standard on how you operate regardless of the regulation. It cannot be just the regulator that is going to come and tell you what to do and what not to do. You need to have the expertise, and you need to have the knowledge of understanding what is right and what is wrong. In this industry, it is important, I think, to understand these things. And that is also one of the reasons why at Betsson, for example, we do have a certain minimum standard that we apply across the group, just so we are comfortable about the fact that we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think, look, unfortunately, we're actually running out of time. I know Renz wants us off the stage, but it is an interesting, subject. And I think it's not just, the responsibility of the operator. I think it needs to be, the game provider, the regulator, the operator. It needs to be at a state level. Responsible gambling is, a global issue right now. And I think some regulators are going to so much extremes. Other regulators can say, well, let's take it a little bit more lightly and we can pick up a lot of business, because now we're going on, is it sustainable for the market? Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I really enjoyed it. I want to say thank you to the panelists. Let's give them a warm hand. And thank you, Sigma.